I used to visit this one Starbucks here in the UK, and I still do from time to time, but I had a really bad experience there once that put me off going for almost a whole year. It was during this really hot summer in 2018. I don't know if many other English people remember, but it was scorching. I'm not usually one to go for a frappuccino, but oh my god, it was just so roasting outside that I needed something to cool myself off. I went for a frappuccino to keep cool. Not just that, but the staff had really ramped up their air conditioning to keep themselves nice and cool too, so walking in and feeling that artificial breeze hit me, combined with the thought of an ice cream coffee, was heaven. Anyway, just as I was enjoying my frappe, I got a tap on the shoulder. It was an older man, but that's not hard considering I was 19. He gently placed another frappe on my table. Then, in a way that was actually quite sweet, he said, "A girl as pretty as you deserves a treat on a day like this. Keep yourself nice and cool, sweetheart. This one's on me." I actually thought it was quite a nice gesture at first, a little suspicious, but still very nice of him. So, I did what any polite young woman would do. I thanked him, but had no real intention of drinking it, only because I was so full from the first one. But then, as soon as the guy walked out of the Starbucks, I looked up to see one of the baristas at my table. I can't remember exactly what he said, not word for word anyway, but this is basically the gist of it. He told me that he felt he had to warn me because the man who'd given me the drink had literally gone into the toilet with it just minutes before he handed it to me. At first, they hadn't thought anything of him ordering the same drink. It was a hot day and all that, and he made no indication that he was intending to give it to anyone else. Thank God the barista was alert enough to notice what he'd done immediately after receiving it because, as he said, the man could have put anything in there, and we'd all be completely unaware. What if I'd actually had the room to drink it, or maybe been a little more naive? There could have been drugs in that frap, and that's about the nicest thing I can possibly think of that could have been slipped in there while he was in the bloody toilet, for God's sake. My name is Cassie, and I want to tell you about one of the nicest, most generous, and honorable people I ever knew in my entire life. His name is Miguel Aljanid, and he was my manager at the coffee shop I worked at up until the spring of last year. Miguel's father was Lebanese, while his mom was from Colombia. Although they were of different religions and backgrounds, they fell in love over their mutual love of coffee. Together, they opened a small but successful cafe in Brooklyn. Once they retired, they passed it on to Miguel. I started working for Miggy, our cute little nickname for him, back in the summer of 2019, and he was by far the best boss I'd ever worked with. He mostly employed college students like myself on a part-time basis and understood that we needed flexibility as well as financial support to live semi-comfortably while completing our studies. As a result, we worked our butts off for him. We wanted him to succeed. We wanted his business to succeed, not just for him or us, but in honor of his parents, who had one of the most magically romantic stories I'd ever heard. But then, the virus, which shall not be named, hit, and like so many other businesses in New York City, the cafe's profits began to dip before disappearing altogether. We tried to make things work, adapting to becoming a mostly delivery-based service, but a combination of fear and hardship made things almost impossible. One by one, Miggy had to let us go. In the end, there were only myself and 2 other employees working in rotation to keep the cafe running. And when I say rotation, I mean heavy rotation. By the summer of 2020, I was down to 2 3-hour shifts a week, and all I did was go in, clean, prep for deliveries, and then go home. Miggy and 1 delivery driver would then run the business for a full 15-hour day. After business hours, Miggy would perform a full antiviral clean-down to pass inspection from city officials. If he failed them, the cafe would be shut down indefinitely. For a while, Miggy was working 19-hour days and barely sleeping at night due to the stress of potentially losing his business. I know this was quite the introduction, and you're probably asking, yeah, this is grim, but how is it scary? Well, the scary part of this story isn't so much the loss of the cafe, which I'm almost certain is being turned into a Starbucks or a Shake Shack or something by now. It's that I watched a man lose his mind in real time. Time after time, he refused help from us because he simply didn't have the money to pay the wages. At one point, we even offered to work an extra hour for free just to help him keep going. But, as you can imagine, he said he'd rather close up entirely than accept slave labor, his words, not ours. He lost weight and became emotionally and mentally distant. It was soul-crushing to behold. We all wanted to fight the virus, so I'm not saying all this is some kind of anti-lockdown, anti-masker type stuff, but the costs the measures incurred were truly painful to witness. Things started to look up around the beginning of fall as the mayor or the governor or whoever it was began the whole reopening phase. We were actually allowed to reopen to an extent, and although capacity was cut to like 25%, we all got more hours, and Miggy actually started to make a profit again. I remember him just not showing up to work one day, and we all got pretty worried and began calling his cell phone. When someone finally picked up, it was his cousin. Miggy had passed out for almost 18 hours, the first time he'd slept more than 8 hours in almost 7 months. We just ran the cafe as best we could, hoping we'd do Miggy proud, and figured he'd show back up at work when he was able to. When he did, he wouldn't stop apologizing for his no-show. In our minds, he'd done absolutely nothing wrong, and we were just happy that he'd had a chance to get some real rest. Besides, with the loosening of restrictions, things were looking up for the cafe, and we all figured we were over the worst of it. But then, on the morning of October 6th, we got some very, very bad news. I remember it like it was yesterday, even what day of the week it was, a Tuesday. Due to a spike in recent cases, the governor introduced what was called a microcluster strategy to contain the problem. The cafe happened to fall into one of the red zones, which were subject to the harshest kind of restrictions. Previously, because we were delivering food and coffee, we were deemed an essential business and were allowed to stay open, even if we weren't allowed to have any customers inside. But under the new microcluster thing, the little baklavas and oblias weren't enough to be considered substantial foodstuffs, so we were forced to close again. Miggy was holding back tears when he called me about an hour after the news was announced. As much as I tried, I just couldn't find the words to reassure him. Honestly, I knew we were in trouble, and I was terrified for him. That cafe was his entire life, and once again, it looked as if it was going to be taken away from him. As you can guess, due to a lot of people working from home, the demand was absolutely enormous. So, once again, Miggy went back to working 19-hour days, mostly alone, to keep deliveries running. A coworker of ours, Ronnie, attempted a kind of intervention and went in during his days off to try and talk Miggy into getting some rest. And Miggy fired him on the spot. To fire someone like that just wasn't in Miggy's character. We knew he was grieving, but to think it was having that much of an effect on his personality was just devastating for us. Ronnie wasn't even mad, he was just sorry and figured he'd go talk to him once he was feeling more like himself. Now, we know that day might never come. After the holidays, I knew I might have to walk on eggshells around Miggy, that he was cracking up from being stressed and overworked. But the reality was so much worse. Miggy had never been particularly religious, so I remember the shock I felt when I saw that he had mounted a large wooden cross in the cafe's office. That might not be anything to worry about with anyone else, but when I walked in and saw the way he was just staring at it, it was a bizarrely disturbing sight. When I asked if he was okay, he gave me this really faint like although he was right there in front of me, his reply came from somewhere very, very far away. Then he asked if I wanted to pray with him. You know, I said yes, and despite being a pretty staunch atheist, I bowed my head and held Miggy's hand while he said a little prayer. I honestly thought it would be some generic "Lord, let us be grateful for all we have" kind of thing, and I'd never have remembered the exact words if he didn't mention which book of the Bible he was quoting from. It was from Hosea, and I just had to look it up to find exactly which one, but it's Hosea 13 verse 16. Miggy said, "Samaria shall become desolate, for she hath rebelled against her God." They shall fall by the sword, their infants shall be dashed into pieces, and their women with child shall be ripped up. Amen. I didn't even know the Bible contained things like that, and I literally didn't know what to say, so I just added a weak amen before I walked out of the cafe to carry on with my work. The rest of my shift passed without event, and it wasn't until I got a text from a coworker the next day that I actually got scared for Miggy's mental health. The text came through in the early afternoon, accompanied by a picture message. "Miggy's been drawing these for hours," it said. I thought he was doing work on the books, but no, he's been drawing these. At first, I had no idea what I was looking at, but I remember feeling this deep chill run through me when I saw just how many there were. Miggy had drawn maybe 50 or 60 of these huge, lidless eyes, and surrounding each larger eye were rings of much smaller eyes. They were rough sketches, not too much detail to them, but it was clear that there were literally hundreds of little eye rings covering several sheets of paper. I asked Elena, the girl who had sent the pictures, if she could ask Miggy what they were, but she said he was acting really weird and she was too scared to confront him about it. She then followed up by asking me if I could see if he was okay, so next time I was working, I did just that. I know this sounds crazy, but his explanation actually eased my mind a little. It was obvious that Miggy had found a new passion for religion due to the stress of his ordeal, and I figured if it helped him cope, who was I to interfere? When he explained that what he was drawing were angels, let's just say I was confused but open to understanding. When I asked why he'd envisioned angels to be so, well, disturbing, he produced a small leather-bound Bible and began quoting from the book of Ezekiel. I've managed to find the exact verse he was quoting from and I've chopped it down so you get an idea of what he had in mind. As I looked, I saw a wheel on the ground beside each. Bill Dwayne Wheeler Sr. was a portly man of medium height and thinning hair who spent the majority of his early 20s traveling around the western U.S. It was during this period that he fell in love with the world-famous city of sin, Las Vegas. By 2010, Bill had been married 5 times to 4 different women, which might make him seem like something of a ladies' man. But ask Bill's sister, Pat, and you'd get a very different answer. Bill had no brains, she once said. He was looking for true love, so women could just about talk him into anything. Couple that with the fact that Bill was practically surrounded by beautiful young women, and you start to understand why his life was something of an emotional and financial time bomb. Bill ran 2 businesses in the state of Washington. One was a legitimate private investigator's business, and the other was a considerably seedier grab-and-go coffee stand. The coffee stand was known for its barely clothed female baristas, who would serve small coffees at big prices. Some of the grab-and-go regulars called it the sexpresso place, where the baristas blurred the line between tongue-in-cheek flirtatiousness and straight-up peep shows. But legal trouble stemming from the stands wasn't the only controversy in Bill's life, as his eventual disappearance and presumed death would prove to be one of the most mysterious and sinister scandals in Nevada's history. Bill might have owned businesses up in Washington, but his home was Vegas. Around 10 a.m. on May 26, 2010, Bill landed at Las Vegas McCarran International Airport after a brief trip to the Evergreen State. Bill's brother-in-law, Mark Tetzlaff, gave him a ride to his home in Spring Valley, just west of the Vegas Strip. Bill spent the journey on the phone with his wife, Carol, and although they appeared to share a deep emotional bond, their relationship had been tumultuous. The couple had adopted Bill's biological grandson, and Carol cared for the boy just as much as her own 2 sons from a previous marriage. Despite the couple's rekindled romance, Bill and Carol had been married, divorced, and remarried. Cracks were forming in their marriage, and Bill hadn't planned to stay in Vegas for very long. After picking him up from the airport, Mark joined Bill in the garage of the Spring Valley house to fix up his prized white Mercedes. They had no luck, so instead, Bill planned on driving back to Washington in a tan 2003 Toyota Tundra. According to Carol, after returning home, she and Bill had an amiable discussion about family and finances before Bill departed for his second home, a vacant 4-bedroom rental just a few miles away on West Tropicana Avenue. It was there that Bill loaded a $15,000 deluxe espresso machine onto the Tundra's truck bed, one he intended to install at a new grab-and-go outlet near Seattle. Later that evening, Bill began the 1,000-mile, 16-hour drive back to Washington, telling a friend that he'd be back in Vegas before the week's end. But in reality, it was the last time anyone would see him alive. 3 days later, a man on a motorcycle passing through Victorville, California, came across a burned-out truck. It was the exact same Toyota that Bill had been driving. The inferno had blown out the truck's windows and turned the tan paint job to a scorched ash. Investigators determined that the fire had been deliberately started in the truck's bed, where the huge espresso machine now lay as a smoldering husk. But there was no sign of Bill Wheeler. Half of Bill's family believed he was dead, while the other half believed it was an attempt at faking his own death. Those who believed he was still alive cited the fact that he was deeply in debt and on the verge of forfeiting his real estate for failing to keep up with mortgage payments. This was on top of the sizable alimony payments he owed his series of ex-wives, and he was facing charges in Washington for allegedly allowing his baristas to engage in illegal activities. Faking his own death would allow him to evade all impending legal proceedings. But what tangible evidence supports the fake death theory? Well, if Mark Tetzlaff is to be believed, Bill is living a life of luxury on the island of Puerto Rico. He was supposedly sending a ton of his money there, stashing it away. Mark later told investigating FBI agents, who took his claim seriously enough to launch an investigation in conjunction with the IRS. Besides his family, law enforcement officials from 3 separate states were actively hoping to locate him, with some declaring that Bill was most certainly still alive. Bill's family also stated that despite the supposed success of the espresso stands, they were more of a burden than a boon. Some of his employees suffered from drug problems and were said to routinely steal from the registers to feed their habits. They believed their father wanted out but was too proud to say so. In his mind, there was no other solution than to manufacture his own demise. They also pointed to the fact that cadaver dogs have yet to find a single trace of Bill's body anywhere near the I-15. Despite the compelling evidence of his continued existence, many believe that Bill was the victim of a murderous conspiracy. They argued that he wouldn't just disappear without saying goodbye to his family. Some, like Bill's sister, Pat, insisted his disappearance resulted from foul play. "My brother's dead. We just haven't found his body yet." This theory was supported by Bill's actions leading up to his disappearance, as he was acting like a man preparing to close a chapter in his life. Bill was not only planning on opening a used car lot in Snohomish County, Washington, but he also had an important testicular cancer surgery lined up for the week following his disappearance. It also makes no sense that a man in such a dire financial position would set fire to $30,000 worth of assets in the middle of the desert. It's clear that despite the veneer of success and stability, Bill had many enemies. When an article detailing Bill's disappearance appeared on SeattleWeekly.com, a vitriolic debate erupted in the comments section. Friends, family members, ex-employees, and business associates waged a war of words, some claiming he was a monster, while others said he was a good but imperfect man. Even his brother-in-law, Mark Tetzlaff, with whom he was apparently fairly close, once called him a pervert who regularly practiced infidelity. Bill was also said to overindulge in the drug OxyContin to lessen the pain of his chemotherapy, and many noted that he seemed to be taking more of the drug than prescribed. This could mean he did business with drug dealers in both Washington and Nevada, and we all know what dealers do to folks who run up bills they can't pay. Not only that, but Bill's treatment of his employees might also have caused a great deal of offense. He was said to be selling OxyContin to some of his drug-addicted baristas. On more than one occasion, he faced accusations of violent misconduct in the workplace. One of the women convicted of public indecency was just 18 years old, with her close family having no idea she was involved in such a thing. Suddenly learning this would certainly make a father or brother extremely angry, possibly even angry enough to inflict physical harm. As far as law enforcement is concerned, foul play simply cannot be ruled out. Police also noted inconsistencies in statements made by his wife, Carol, following his disappearance. An official from the U.S. Department of Justice said, none of their stories of his disappearance coincide with telephone records or neighbors' testimony. Dana Fitzpatrick, who worked at one of his coffee shacks, stated multiple times that she believes Bill was murdered. He told me he had to go to Vegas for a short business trip and that he'd be returning 4 days later to go to Chelan with Michelle. Michelle was apparently Bill's girlfriend and the woman he was planning on leaving his wife for. But Dana also said that Bill showed her and other employees a picture of Carol before telling them, this woman is not to be allowed anywhere near his business. Pat Thurbush, the sister who believes Bill is deceased, has also made multiple claims that Carol had something to do with his death. She called Carol ruthless and claimed she long harbored feelings of deep resentment towards her brother. He said he'd call as soon as he left Carol's, she said. So he had to be already dead not to call. I don't think he ever left there alive. Yet if that were true, it would mean Mark Tetzlaff was lying about Bill departing Vegas in the tan Toyota. But what would Mark have to gain from such a lie? Well, everything. Following his disappearance, not only did Carol inherit all of Bill's businesses, but she also made Mark the general manager of all of his Vegas-based outlets. It seems no coincidence that Bill disappeared just as he put plans in motion to divorce Carol. Mark was quick to produce a 2009 insurance policy that confirmed Bill and Carol were legally married. Bill's children from his second marriage also claimed foul play, with Bill Jr. stating, I have no doubt that Carol did something to my father. She's motivated by greed and money. This is no mere hearsay either, but something Bill Jr. was happy to swear to in front of a court of law if given the opportunity. However, even with the chance to do so, he suddenly declined, which might have something to do with the fact that Carol is the sole legal guardian of Bill Jr.'s 8-year-old son. This was done while Bill Jr. was enlisted in the Air Force and was mainly the result of a vengeful move from Bill Jr.'s ex-wife, who was also said to have forged his signature on the court documents. Carol, who has since renamed the coffee stand's Carol's Espresso, made a counterstatement, which read, Bill Jr. is the eldest of his father's children, but he is not his biological son, making him no longer the oldest. Also, my 8-year-old is afraid of him for threatening to put him in the trunk of his car as a punishment. Bill Jr. has flat out called this a lie and claims that Carol has poisoned his son against him. He also claims that he had a good relationship with his father and was shocked to hear that Bill had written in his will that I specifically desire that my son, Bill Dwayne Wheeler Jr., receive nothing whatsoever from my estate. It makes sense that the expansion of Bill's family circle might lead to his other children receiving less of a share, but to cut him out of the will completely seems very unusual. My dad had no reason to run, and he left me in charge of the coffee stands before he vanished, Jr. later said. Sure, he was behind on bills, but he always was behind on bills, and he always paid up. His patterns were very consistent, and I know this because we were in constant communication. Then all of a sudden, he just vanishes. Mark Tetzlaff felt such an overwhelming urge to dispel the violent rumors that he held an interview outside one of Carol's coffee stands, stating that neither he nor Carol had anything to do with Bill Sr.'s death. Carol isn't going to give them any money, he said, referring to Bill's kids and sister. That's why they say she hired someone to kill him, but that's categorically false. Mark claimed that Bill had been funneling money into offshore accounts, even producing paperwork that supposedly confirmed it. Mark also stated that after inheriting Bill's businesses, he discovered that he owed hundreds of thousands of dollars in back taxes. I just paid off $50,000, Mark said during the interview, and that didn't even put a dent in the total amount. I'd bet my last dollar that Bill was trying to escape the IRS. They've been all over the grab-and-go offices for years now. The FBI even got involved at one point. If it were me, that's exactly what I'd do, fake my death, burn up a few assets to make it look real. He might have fooled his kids, but he hasn't fooled us. As disturbing and mysterious as this case is, when seen from Bill Jr.'s perspective, it takes on a deep melancholy. Bill Jr. seems to have spent the majority of his adult life emulating his missing father. Citing his law enforcement experience in the military, Junior opened a background check firm, Century Investigation Services, just like the one his father ran. He also opened his own espresso stand in the Everett Mall area of Washington, which he named Gravango, just like his father's. It's also clear that, out of all of Bill Wheeler's relatives, his oldest biological son had been the most active in tracking him down. He discovered that on the day of his disappearance, his father's phone was completely inactive, contrary to Mark Tetzlaff's claims that Bill made calls to Carol and his businesses after arriving at his Spring Valley home. Junior also discovered that on May 29, 3 days after his father's disappearance, his cell phone showed signs of malfunctioning. This was long after investigators claimed that his truck was set alight, meaning someone was in possession of the phone and destroyed it when they determined it to be a liability. This divided investigators, with some claiming this is evidence that Bill retained his cell phone, despite one being found in the Toyota's burned-out wreckage, while others claimed it proves the phone remained on Bill's body until he was either cremated or disposed of in some other fashion days after his supposed disappearance. Perhaps the most compelling piece of evidence that Bill Jr. has presented are his photographs taken at the final place his father was thought to have been, the vacant rental house in Vegas where the espresso machine was stored. In the presence of Vegas police officers, Jr. took pictures of red stains on a carpet, as well as gaping holes that appeared to have been smashed in the walls. Several bottles of bleach were on a countertop, most completely empty. Even the accompanying police officers believed it looked like a crime scene. When Junior showed the evidence to the authorities, they agreed it made for a very convincing argument. When confronted by police, Mark Tetzlaff claimed the stain was from an earlier ink spill and that tenants had left the house in a filthy condition, hence all the bleach bottles. But that would be a rather convenient coincidence, I'm sure you'll agree. As for escaping to Puerto Rico and the much-discussed offshore accounts, Bill Jr. claimed that he poured through his father's records long before Carol and Mark ever arrived in Washington. There were no signs of any money funneling, secret accounts, or death-faking intrigue whatsoever. In fact, Jr. claims that the most powerful evidence of his father's murder is that Carol and Mark had already faked a bunch of paperwork before he even disappeared, thus proving premeditation and conspiracy to murder. At the end of the day, the only thing we know for sure is that investigators from a variety of different agencies have been completely unable to decipher what amounts to a dense and enduring riddle. Just about every theory imaginable has been floated to explain Bill's disappearance. But the bottom line is that no one knows what happened to him, nor are we ever likely to find out. Las Vegas has one of the most sophisticated missing persons task forces in the Western world, as more than 2,000 people go missing there every year, but even they have been unable to find him. Perhaps the general feeling is best summed up by a quote from Bill's sister, Pat, who once said, "I just want to find my brother's body. That way, we can all be at peace. We can all just put this behind us."